thank you for interviewing with us today. It's true honor. You and your music appear along so many iconic figures in progressive and electronic music. But there's also a lot of invisible appearances too, like in film, video, game production. You record producer. How do you scope
Yeah.
out what your next projects are going to be? I mean, how do you decide what you're going to do next?
Well, I don't know. I hate to burst the bubble on it, but it's there's no grand plan. It's kind of what happens next, and whatever just appears next, assuming that it meets the a reasonable degree of the appropriate criteria, is what gets done next. I mean, for instance, early on, everything was focused on making the Synergy albums, and then the side work, session work, and then working with other people, first Nectar and then Peter Gabriel, which was tremendously enjoyable and had its own profile, started to, in many ways, interfere with my ability to have enough time in the days, weeks, and months to make more Synergy projects as frequently as I might have otherwise. But there wasn't a grand plan. It was just, well, there's an opportunity to do a Peter Gabriel album and a tour, and it's going to eat a year and a half. I guess there won't be a Synergy album for a while. And the same thing with other projects that I'm not as, maybe not as well known for, but people are aware of them, things like Foreigner or Bonnie Tyler or some of the other things that I had done. They popped up. They were good people to work with. It would broaden my horizons. Notwithstanding that in the music business, there's managers, lawyers, and record companies always looking for what the payday is at the end of the day, too. So that nudges things in certain directions, but not always.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about some of your, most recent projects?
Well, the recent ones have been very behind the scenes. So people, actually over the last 15 years, there have been things with XM Radio, right when they were starting up, where I created the original Sonic logos, which they're not using anymore since they merged with Sirius. But for the first almost decade that they were on the air, I created literally in the hundreds of there was a logo theme and variations on that for all of the different channels, and custom music that was used by different ones of the channels. And for me, it was almost a return to my radio roots, where I got started in college in commercial radio before being able to break out as a recording artist. So that was a lot of fun. That went on over, like I said, about a decade. And in the middle of that, there was an opportunity to do custom composing for Disney for their theme park in Japan, which was a real honor because the music director had pulled several people that he liked from the electronic world together, and including, for me, which was an honor, Tomita was doing a different part of the park. We didn't collaborate, we didn't even meet, but this was the type of people that he was hiring to be his composers and producers to create the music is for the Disney Sea theme park in Tokyo.
Yeah.
And so I had a chance to see that. That was really the equivalent of doing 3 albums worth of material. So, people keep saying, well, you haven't recorded anything. But if I were to add that up, and then the next thing that I did was a multi-year arrangement with Tribune Broadcasting, where I was doing things very similar to what was going on at XM, except this was for television. And it was creating custom themes for the programming, the logos for all the owned and operated stations that they used, that they had, news themes, even got down to the occasional cooking show. But there was an Emmy award-winning segment, a little spot for the Chicago Cubs that used my music with video that had been created for the spot. And that lasted until just about a little over a year and a half ago, working on that under contract. So I've been doing a lot, and like I started to say, people say you haven't recorded much. But if you take the aggregate of everything that I've recorded under these kind of contracts, and there have been many others, just smaller ones, even the big ones that ran for years, it's probably more than my output was under the project name Synergy.
Yeah, it's enormous. It's an enormous amount of work. A lot of times, that behind the scenes type of work doesn't get, quite the respect that it actually deserves. It's an enormous amount of work and effort. On your website and through some of the other information out there on the web, there was a hint of a new Synergy album, Tower Indigo, on your site. And is this still a possible release? Is this
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It is, absolutely, because one of the things that's come up in the last, actually just as things were winding down with Tribune Broadcasting, there's an opportunity to consolidate the Synergy albums. They've almost never been out of print. The only time that, from their original releases starting in the mid-1970s, there was a little gap when the original record company, Passport, went bankrupt, and things got tied up in court for a little time. So I think there was probably still catalog out there in the warehousing system. People could still find the records, but they weren't being actively, they weren't with an active label for a couple of years. And then I started up my own little boutique label after the court case, the dust settled, and I had the rights back. And it was at the very dawn of the internet in the early to mid-1990s. So I started a little label called Third Contact, which was just a boutique label and to sell CDs on the internet. That's all there was. And I tried it as an experiment to see what happened, and it actually worked out very nicely, so that within just a handful of years, Polygram Records picked up the entire catalog under the Third Contact label. And there'd always been a placement on it, so even while I was doing these other projects, the broadcast related projects or media projects, there was always some label. It was Polygram. They got bought by Universal. That contract expired, and then Voice Print out of the UK had it under contract for about a decade. And that ended itself just a very short time ago. And it was at that point I was approached by somebody I'd known in the record industry who said, why don't you become the label? Don't license it to other labels. Make Third Contact a standalone through the distributor that he works at the time with. And so we put that together, and that's where I've got the opportunity. The others were reissued labels for the most part. But with this, I have the freedom to say I want to make new records, and now I have some time to make some new records. Let's do that. And they are kind of underway. So Tower Indigo was the first of the new pieces of music that was sort of loaned on a promotional album to one of the fellow labels under the same distribution group, Project Recordings. And they were doing a compilation of electronic music. And it just seemed like a good way to sort of test the waters with an in-progress version of one of the pieces of music.
Yeah.
And that was about a year ago. And the response was great. So there are more pieces that are in various states of completion. And I always hesitate to put an exact release date on anything because you never know what's going to come up. But it's absolutely planned to do one or more new Synergy projects under the Synergy name of the Third Contact.
It's beautiful. And I noticed also you a lot of your work is now available also through these high quality download modes, like HD tracks. I think you're using. Yeah. Do these download recordings they really sound as good as the original releases? I mean, I haven't had the opportunity to download one, but in your opinion, you feel it really matches up?
I think it really does. One of the things that we did, if you notice, there are only 3 featured Synergy albums on HD tracks because it's an expensive process, but we actually went back to the original quarter-inch tapes, which they'd all been digitized, the original mixes, back earlier in the CD era. And they actually had another pass in the early 2000s, but those were all 16-bit, 44.1 kilohertz CD standard, which is very good, and it was about as good as you could get in the 1980s when the CD spec was set. But in order to really capture all the nuances on the original analog tapes, you need the higher sample rates and the greater bit depth. And you can hear it. There are things they're subtle, and they're audiophile kinds of details. But there's a crispness, there's a clarity, there is less mushiness in the reverb tails, the little details that really, in my case, it always broke my heart when we left the studio because it never sounded as good as that again. By the time it ended up on LP and got to the consumers, it was always a compromise. CDs were a lot better, but they still weren't quite there. But the super high resolution, 192 kilohertz, those sound, in an A/B test, I can't tell whether I'm listening to the analog master or a digital copy of it. They're so good that the third album, Quartz, there had been a problem with the analog mastering machine, a small distortion that crept in when we were doing the mixes back in the late 1970s. And when we were going to LP, the transfer, the mastering engineer rightly said, they'll never hear it. There is so much more distortion inherent in an LP that the little bit you've got on the tape, it's not going to be a problem.
That's right.
And that was actually accurate. And it actually held through the CD. When we went back and transferred at 192 kilohertz, 24-bit, it became so apparent. And to my mind, at that point, I was the one who kind of put my foot down. I said, we can't, in good conscience, be selling at premium prices for something that has this kind of distortion inherent in it. And the only way around it was that the original multi-track, the 24-track, obviously didn't have the distortion. It had all the separate tracks. And I went back and remixed almost every song on that album for these new HD. So the new mixes are incredibly, I think, faithful reproductions of the old mixes. I set down the requirements that we wouldn't use new, modern techniques. We'd use some in, say, noise reduction and things, but I wouldn't use a kind of reverb that could not possibly have existed back in those days, or certain kinds of digital effects. I probably could have created a whole different sounding record out of masters, out of the multi-track masters, if I chose to do that. But I really wanted a faithful reproduction of what it was supposed to be, although I did fix a couple of mix errors that had haunted me for 4 decades.
And I have to imagine that, that was probably, one of the most difficult things about recording back then. See, there's some recording artists such as yourself, and Kraftwerk comes to mind. You guys really pioneered, that early high quality recordings. You produced some amazingly clean sounds given the limitations of the recording equipment, but you must have been also really aware that what you were hearing as you were performing and composing wasn't going to translate, the same way to the vinyl.
Absolutely. There's vinyls, so it really inherently flawed in a lot of ways as a transfer medium. I know there are aficionados of vinyl, and I don't mean to get into a fight with them. If they find it pleasant what they're hearing, then more power to them. Enjoy it. But as a composer and as a producer / engineer in the studio, for me, it was quite a realization that what I was going for in the studio was not going to make it onto vinyl. It couldn't. I mean, the first album, the first Synergy album, had tons of low frequency energy that simply couldn't be fit into the grooves. It would have mechanically caused the stylus to jump out, or it would have required that we drop time to have a very short side. There were things that just, inherently couldn't be done. Vinyl's not capable of doing it. There, also through the whole recording chain, analog tape, vinyl, there are phase errors that are introduced. There are errors just in the way that the stylus and the arm track an LP, which is not the same way that the cutting light is creating it. Mm-hmm. So there are different kinds of, it's kind of a geometrically related errors in the tracking. And you get to compensate for them in the studio. As you get, I was fairly naive on my first album. I just went for what sounded good. By the later ones, I was thinking about the process and what would have to happen. But, excuse me. So, it's changed. Of course, digital has changed all that all over again. There's some inherent problems in that too, but they're far more manageable.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on, some of your thoughts anyway, on the evolution of soft synths, from like the pure form synthesizers? I mean, you've obviously had your hands probably on, every type of synth as it was breaking, and utilized it, and performed and recorded it. But what are your thoughts on where synthesizers are going now? With workstations, everything's sampled. But how do you feel about it? That type of equipment.
Well, it's a big, broad topic. I was very fortunate that early on I was given the opportunity to be part of some early digital synthesis and recording projects at Bell Laboratories. And this is in the 70s. I mean, literally within a year or so after my first album. So we're talking 1975, 76.
Then you must know Rory Spiegel then.
Oh, yeah, quite well.
Yeah.
In fact, that's where I met her through that. She was another one on that project. Roger Powell was there. It was under Max Matthews' department, and I was working with a guy named Joe Olive, and he was working on speech synthesis, which he was attempting to turn into singing, and it was quite a challenge. But it was all on the same systems, multiple different systems that were on different projects. And the interesting thing was to see what the capabilities were going to be. I mean, they were there already, but they weren't available to the broader world outside of the phone company. And that meant going back to the Moog oscillators, as good as they were, and Bob Moog's instruments were, to my mind, about as good as they got. They were just wonderful sounding, but the limitations became even more stark of what those instruments could do in light of what was going on the research end of digital. And it probably recalibrated my mindset a little differently than some of the people out there who are the old synth collectors and the analog versus digital people. Because I was hearing classes that found out of the digital that weren't going to come out of analog, and that I really wanted to use, and in fact had an opportunity to use even during the 70s by recording parts of things over at the laboratories. And same thing with digital recording and sonic manipulation. I mean, I could see this creative world was emerging out of the research being done there and at Stanford and in Paris and a few of the other academic centers. So if I reduced it down to a common denominator, one of the things I found was that the sounds that I would hear in my head that I wanted to end up as part of the compositions or part of the music production on the recordings wasn't as dependent on which manufacturer I got, whether it was a Moog or an Oberheim or a Roland or a Yamaha. If you if I had my hands on almost any of those things, digital, analog, whatever, my instincts as a composer, arranger, and my production head, as it's applied to that, kind of ended up with the same results no matter what I was working with. And I think that was the revelation, that as long as there was a baseline threshold, the Moogs clearly were above that, and so they were a great mainstay because they were so reliable and quiet and clean and just well constructed. But as long as I had something like that, I could do what I wanted within that realm. When I bumped into those limits, then it was time to go to other classes of sounds. And the first things that I kind of jumped to were the Bell Labs experiments in FM synthesis using software from Stanford in the late 70s. And that gave me a whole new class of sounds that I just couldn't do with analog. So from that point forward, I'm just not that fussy. I mean, I use mostly digital now.
Okay.
Sorry, that was abrupt ending there.
Yeah, okay. And so, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if you wanted me to narrow it down. I mean, I use a variety of different digital soft synthesis products. I still have a Kurzweil, which is a digital instrument. It simulates a lot of analog-like qualities, but the things that, the inherent qualities of digital versus analog, again, some of it is that the digital in its basic form can be incredibly precise, which can be a little cold and sterile. But that's been addressed by a lot of more sophisticated algorithms and processing in the digital realm, which brings back some of the intangible humanity that's needed in it. And the analog ones are what they are, but there's only so much they can do. They are limited to a certain class of sounds, which is fine. There's a lot to work with in that too. So it's not as though they're crippled. They just stake out a particular area, and that's all they can do.
You've worked with probably some of the most influential people certainly in rock and even other genres over the past 3 decades. If you had to look back to maybe a single defining moment in your career that broke you out onto the scene, what would it be?
Well, I mean, I can't discount that the decade or so with Peter Gabriel was an enormous amount of visibility. Took it beyond what I was, even though I had a couple of the Synergy albums under my belt at that point, it was still somewhat an electronic cult at the core. It was a little broader. I mean, it's hard to believe now, but the first Synergy album reached some of the upper reaches of Billboard charts. That never happens for an electronic album anymore. Maybe something that's a descendant of in electronic dance music or something, but not a pseudo-classical avant-garde. It just doesn't happen that way.
Maybe a new age in the new age group.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But besides that, I mean, after Peter Gabriel, it was number one albums in Europe, and ones that charted. I think I hit number one with at least one thing while I was with him over here, and lots and lots of touring, and that of course raises visibility. So I would have to credit that. Of course, Peter was a wonderful working experience too. I mean, we're still friends, we're still in touch. He's a very creative thinker, which is, not to demean other rock acts that I've worked with, but normally the way I've phrased it before is that when I was brought in on somebody else's record, it was because they needed to pick my brain so I could add something to their project.
Well,
and
yeah.
With Peter, yes, he did bring me in that way, but I always learned something from him because he was looking at things a little more obliquely, more uniquely. He had his own artistic visions, which were not commonplace. And so that was a great experience for me. It was a real two-way street.
How were you introduced to him? How did that relationship come about?
Well, it started in a bunch of different ways. But one of I first met Peter when I was in college, and Genesis was a baby band, and they were playing the first handful of American dates in 1973, and they were at Princeton University, and I was doing college radio. I was already building synthesizers for Rick Wakeman at that point, so I was already somewhat insinuated into the Yes world, band and management. But I leveraged a little of that, along with a guy who was a very close friend of mine, still is to this day, who was the program director at the college radio station we were both at. And we arranged to do interviews with this up-and-coming baby band, Genesis. So I actually met Peter then, but he doesn't recall it. I remember. It was kind of a blur. And I was focusing more on talking with Tony Banks at keyboards anyway. But what had happened was then about a year later, I was signed as a solo artist doing the Synergy project. And it was through, there's a little inside baseball here, but or inside showbiz, but Passport Records that I was signed to was actually owned by a parent company called Gem Records, Jem, and they were the company that was known as the import company. And their big thing was they brought records mostly from the UK, but from all over the world into the United States, and they had a very good distribution network to the stores that sold that sort of thing. And at that point, Genesis was signed to a division of Buddha Records, which was the company that had the 1910 Fruit Gum Company and the Archies. It was not a good placement for them for an American label. But Gem knew where all the prog fans were, and they specialized in that kind of music. They brought in a lot they basically broke Genesis in America. They were moving more imports than the domestically produced product.
Yeah, Gem. I just you mentioned Gem, and it really brought back a wave for me because we go crazy for the Gem imports. I mean, the Japanese ones, the UK, yep, Gem imports, yep. Wow. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
So they were branded. So they became very important to not only Genesis management, which it was what hit and run music in England, and they also were very important to Charisma Records, because Charisma had the license deal with an American, this ineffective American label. And then at the same time, they were realizing there was more stuff leaving on cargo jets, more Genesis albums leaving England on cargo jets, going into the U.S. and being sold thanks to Gem Records. So they started coordinating the advertising campaigns, the selling England by the pound with the Peter's face on the pound notes distributed across the U.S. was all done by Gem. So they were very important. I was the first American act signed to Gem's Passport label, and I always wanted to be part of the nuts and bolts. I didn't want to just be the recording artist. I wanted to know everything that was going on inside the label. It was, I guess, maybe from having come out of radio administration. So I was there through a lot of this and was friends with all the top people at Gem and the promotion departments, and would meet with the people from Charisma in the management group. So I was around during Peter's last year and a half or so with Genesis. Gem had a huge promotional campaign going for The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. So, I was there. I knew Peter. I knew the band. We were backstage at the Lamb shows. It was more of a friendship of contemporaries. And Peter knew what I was doing. He was a fan of Wendy Carlos. Wendy was somebody that I had a lot of respect for, too. Mm-hmm. And when he left the band and set up to do his own thing, he contacted me and said, would you be interested in, I think it was limited to recording on my first album, or my album, which of course it was. So it was a kind of thing that came about through the business connections, through the mutual connections. There was one additional hump, which was that Bob Ezrin, who was producing Peter's first album, he didn't know me pretty much from a hole in the wall. but we had other mutual friends in the recording studio business who vouched for me and put us together to have an exploratory phone conversation, and we got along great right from the get-go. So he didn't have any objections to Peter bringing in this unknown, weird electronic music artist.
Yeah, the connections are so interesting when you look back on them and connect the dots. Your name recently came up in a Steve Hackett interview we did, and he had mentioned that he ran into you, and you had said to him that you were very proud, and he thought rightly so, as he said, but you were very proud of the work that you did. And it's interesting when I was preparing for this interview and looking back on your work with him, it's pretty clear that like the elements that really the sound elements that really started to set him aside at that time were the electronic sounds, the treatments, the sampling. And then it kind of dawned on me that most of that, if not all of it, originated in your court. So in a sense, that sound, that we love about that decade is really due in large part to your input.
Well, thanks. You're very flattering. I mean, I guess, looking at it objectively, I suppose so. If you look at a track like Games Without Frontiers or some of the other ones of that era, yes, they're very electronic. Peter was all for stripping things back and losing anything that had any hint of conventional rock sensibilities and creating something more unique. And we worked well together. He had a vision for what he wanted, but he gave me enough freedom to create a palette, and then he could pick and choose from some of that. And some of that, but a couple of things was a matter of me getting the right tools in his hand. Things like the first little electronic programmable drum machines, so that he could start with the rhythm approach, which drastically changed his way of writing. Those were, the very first one was a little Paya rock, I forget what they called it, it was like a drum box kit, and I built one for myself, and I thought it was something that he might find intriguing. And it was a kit company in Oklahoma City. They're still in business. My friend who had founded and owned it passed away about 10 years ago, but they made sure that Peter had a chance. They built the kit for him, tested it, and calibrated it. And that is the drum sound you hear on Vico and on Games Without Frontiers and Lead a Normal Life. And it absolutely dominated the third album. And then the next jump was Roger Lynn's machine,
right,
which did essentially the same thing, only with samples of real drum hits instead of electronic drums,
right,
electronic sounds.
And that kind of became an industry standard at that point.
It did.
Yeah.
And so it's, it was just kind of an evolution over time with the equipment, but I was able to be in the right place for the introduction. Same thing, the sampling we were doing at Bell Labs in 1975 was early, primitive. It took $1 million mainframe computers to pull it off. It wasn't in real time, but all the feature sets were kind of there. You could, it was my first hands-on exposure to that sort of thing. So I had gotten wind of a smaller a device that was going to take a very stripped-down set of what the mainframe computers could do and put it in a smaller box coming out of Australia, and that was the Fairlight Synthesizer. And I met with one of the co-inventors in New York just a little before we started the third Gabriel album, and he gave me the whole rundown. It was small enough he could travel with it on a plane, which was absolutely remarkable compared to the rooms and stuff we had, at the laboratories in Murray Hill.
Right.
And here it was doing it, and it was, the fidelity was crunchy. It was mono. It was it was made out of a repurposed office mini computer system, but it worked, and it did it. And I arranged for him to come meet us in England. He was going to England to try and look for a distributor there. And I gave him the number from Ashcombe House, which is where we were recording the album. And about 3 weeks later, he was there. We had it, and the rest is kind of history. It just took off. We sampled like crazy on that album, just trying to feel our way around what was the appropriate thing to do. And again, that's where Peter's creative mind comes into play, because he got so far beyond the usual smashed bottles and banging with a hammer kinds of samples, which are the first instinct in most cases.
Yeah.
And started looking at things that were more dynamic, things like screwdrivers across heating stones, sounds that became some of the signature sounds of the third and fourth album.
Yeah. Yeah, and on another note too, with talking about super creative thinkers, artists, you also did some work with Kate Bush.
Right, that was an outgrowth of. I knew Kate's music and I liked her, and she was in as a background singer on Peter's album.
Yeah.
And then she invited me to come in and just work with her. I mean, very short. These were more like regular day sessions, not the extended months on months that Peter Peter sessions were. But but for me, aside from the fact that I have enormous respect for Kate, she's just one of the nicest, most creative people that I've had a chance to work with. But it was at Abbey Road Studio 2, where all the Beatles recordings were done. Mm-hmm. And as a huge Beatles fan, for me, it was just a thrill to sit in that room and go, this is where it all happened. This is why I'm in the music business.
Yeah. Out of all the artists that have come and gone and are near and dear to me, in terms of, music I grew up with and music I was just fond of and respected, etc. Out of all of them, I have to say I miss her music the most. I really miss her on the scene. It's just amazing work that she gave us.
Yeah, I mean, she's had this very successful comeback in the last 10 weeks or so with the 35 concerts in London, and that were sellouts, and it was a huge buzz. And in fact, I had pictures that I had shot during the third album that Q Magazine out of England, licensed from me for a 30-page feature that they'd done on Kate's retrospective career and what she's up to now. So it was very interesting. And then my old buddy David Rose from the Peter Gabriel Band was playing in her live band during this last stretch.
That's great. I recently found some of his stuff with Random Hold on YouTube. I was so happy because I haven't been able to hear that for so many years. And
yeah, that's great. They were great records.
Talking about roomfuls of equipment, we were talking about the rigs before. A recent interview, we were talking with Tim Story, and he was really candid about the challenges of live performance and synthesizer management. Do any horror stories come to mind from past performances? I mean, your rig was very complex, very sophisticated, very experimental. How did that go?
I was, I don't know, call it showbiz instinct or something. I didn't want any surprises, so I wanted everything as bulletproof as possible. And I was very fortunate that during the years of the arena tours with Peter and having the complex rig, it really didn't do anything horrible. There'd be the occasional nights when I always had backups. So there'd be the odd night when one of the synthesizers might be acting up, and it would take a little bit of either finessing to get it going or using a backup machine, a backup instrument.
Right.
But the Polymode was something that I had on the first Gabriel tour, and it was still a prototype, so I had no backup on that. And I had a full service kit with me, but I was also a kind of a late-comer consultant to Moog on that project, so I knew where the likely problems were. And on the handful of occasions when we had something go really wrong, I was able to repair it between sound check and showtime.
Right, so you could actually perform surgery if it was necessary.
Yeah, I mean, there are photos of me with the lid off. One time I think we got closer to Buffalo, to the home office somewhere, and it was somebody who was a trained tech, and there was a problem, and I remember him taking care of it that day, which was fine with me. It wasn't as though I didn't trust anybody else, but sometimes you're out in the middle of nowhere and there isn't anybody else.
Yeah.
But, you know, if I didn't do it, it wouldn't get done. But over time, my quest had been for simpler and more reliable. And as much, you know, I cut my early teeth on Yes, building Rick Wakeman custom modules and his sea of keyboards that he would have around him. And it looked great for show. It was wonderful. But the more sophisticated the digital synthesizers with multiple layers and multiple memories and complex programming capabilities came into play, the more I found that was strictly for show. And I didn't need to do that. I kept shrinking the rig. Not the capabilities of it. They expanded exponentially.
Right.
But the Tony Levin Band, which was really the core of the Gabriel Band, and we toured for about 10 years during the early 2000s, from like 1999 up to 5 or 6 years ago. And I got it down to my Kurzweil, which has incredible capabilities if you program it in advance, and a tiny little 3 or 4 unit rack to the side of me. And that was it. And that thing was so reliable. There was, you know, everything was stored on the internal hard drive, or later it went on to a flash memory. And I could call up all the patches for the songs and step through them in ways so that I would have different patches for verses, choruses, different breaks, special things. I just tapped the foot pedal, and all the programming that I had done during production rehearsals was there. And it was a far more perfect sounding show. Bigger sounds, more expansive studio quality sounds coming out of the synthesizers could not have been done with analog by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
And it was what I had dreamed about being able to do going back to the 1970s. Got a little taste of it by the 1980s with the Fairlight, but this took it to a high art.
Yeah. I know on a recent Peter Gabriel tour, I don't know if it was this last one or maybe the one before. No, I think it was on the one where he did So again. There were some Korg Kronos spotted.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on the Kronos?
I can't really say. I don't have one. I don't use one. I've been a Kurzweil person for a couple of decades now, and that's probably the last major piece of hardware that I bought. I mean, I've got different generations of what started out as the K2000 series, and it's been fine. And it's still in my studio, where I do use its internal sonic capabilities, but often it's nothing more than the controlling keyboard for software synthesizer.
As a composer, do you map out like precisely how your pieces will be constructed, or do you let the pieces grow a little on their own as they evolve? Is it, how do you approach composition and your creativity?
It depends. Well, it does depend on the pieces, but I usually let a framework grow. It's not as though it's completely filled in. I often use architecture as a sort of a metaphor for what I'm doing, and what I try and do is figure out what's the foundation that I want to go for. Usually some kind of a germ of an idea based on something, a sound, a rhythm, just an experimental approach, and that will generate the underlying nature of how I want this thing to work. And then I'll try to map out where I want the piece to go in terms of sonic changes and rhythmic changes or color changes, whatever it's going to be, and kind of get a feel for that before I go back. Once the framework is up, then I can go back and start to figure out how we're going to brick this thing in and how dense do I want it to be. And sometimes the framework will have already been constructed to hold a heavier, more lush piece than something that's more sparse. But I try to keep an organized approach on it, but there are a lot of accidents of sounds, and finding my way to where I want to go sonically, a little way station might appear that I didn't know was there. Something I hadn't anticipated. Well, constructing a patch, either a mistake is made or it's partially constructed, and something strikes me as, oh, that would be good. That might work here. That might work somewhere else. So there are a lot of other things, and then there's this kind of intangible process, because I've been asked about this, including even a psychiatrist journalist, which was describe how the thoughts appear in your mind. And you know what? I don't know. And I've talked to other composers. It just appears. I don't know whether it would be the same with somebody who writes short stories or film screenplays, and what made you decide to make that character pick up that thing and go and do that other thing. I don't know. It just seemed like the right thing to do.
I know.
And that's kind of what it is. It just seemed like the right thing to do. Now, sometimes when you take a step back and listen to it a day or two later, you go, wow, that was definitely not the right thing to do. So the producer head has to be strong enough to say that that's not good enough. That's got to go away. You got to start again on that part of it. And that's just self-discipline.
Yeah.
But actually, where the process comes from, it's really hard to say. Occasionally I'll hear something. It can be something as innocuous as I'll hear like a little snippet of something that catches my attention in a TV commercial. Some little sound, usually, in a car commercial or something that's got a little bit more of a symphonic or cinematic approach. And I'll go, that's interesting, but I won't copy it. I'll just keep it in mind. Oh, it should do something with low percussion that's kind of bubbling this way, and then I'll sit down with the machinery and start to put something together just with those very basic ground rules. Not cloning or copying anything that I heard, just using that as, you got to jump off from something, and that's the start. And sometimes that won't even survive to the end of the creative process. That's, becomes completely sublimated, but at least it's the launching pad.
I think you've articulated that very, very well, because one of the main reasons why I even started interviewing on our site was I really wanted to drive home for that question. What makes people go? Where does that creativity come from? And I have to say that, the overall consensus is that it's just simply cosmic. It kind of defies. But you've really, you really distilled that down nicely, and it was very, very honest appraisal of your creative process. Do you hear a lot of rehashed synth music today? Is there any music out there that you would consider cutting edge or really pioneering?
It's hard to say. The application of it, there's at least some heirs to the stuff that we were doing, at least in the rock world. I mean, one of the people, and he's become enormously successful, but I don't think he's been recognized for this aspect of it, is Gautier. It's a very creative use of synth and sonic approaches to making his recordings, which I've now gotten to know him, but before I knew him, I was very curious because I thought his big hit record was nicely constructed, and I wanted to know a little bit more. I came on a little documentary about the making of one of his other songs, and watching that, it was so similar in the mindsets that went into Gabriel stuff that I was really impressed. Here's a guy of the next generation who's taking that same kind of oblique creative approach. And we've since gotten to be friends, and I've kind of, maybe been a little bit of him, but, smart guy. But I think that there's also, it's closer in a way than I'm saying to my contributions to the pop and rock world through Peter Gabriel and the other people. Now, the pure electronics, it is out there. The electronic dance music field is huge, and there's probably never been more electronic music in people's lives washing over them in commercials movie themes and, even retro things. I don't know, did you watch The Nick at all on Cinemax?
No.
Steven Soderbergh produced takes place in 1900 in a hospital. But he used Cliff Martinez to do the score, who did an electronic score, an analog-focused electronic score for a movie, basically it was a 10-part movie that took place in 1900. And at first I thought it was a little jarring, a juxtaposition, and then I realized it really worked, and the scoring was very good. And, here's somebody who took the analog approach that I kind of abandoned as a purist in my earlier years, but has really polished it to a high art and really worked beautifully. So I think we've got multiple time epochs coexisting right now, because we've got the electronic dance stuff, which is very computer-based and largely digital, but then there's an entire subgenre of analog that's emerging out of that. And but I think in some ways, and it's going to sound silly, but when I was first starting out, Wendy Carlos had set the bar for all of us. The music for Clockwork Orange,
right.
Obviously all the switched on Bach work, and it was a beautifully constructed, musically relevant. It was just a level of musical thought and production that was really hard to attain. And I was always shooting for that. I'm not sure that I've ever reached that level. But I'm not sure that I've heard anybody else reach it either. So it's kind of, maybe it was of the era of the limitations of the equipment, using it the best possible way, even though we're talking the late 1960s, early 1970s. It's an interesting thing, and I'm just not really sure. And of course, crippling me a little bit in this is that I don't listen to that much of other artists. So there's a possibility that there is some absolute genius out there in electronic composition who I just haven't heard. I just haven't encountered that person.
I understand that for sure. So what's the next evolutionary step for Larry Fast?
Well, probably devoting more time to the new Synergy projects. The label is there, at least for now. I mean, the record industry as a whole is undergoing such seismic shifts. It's hard to say what anything will be. I know that, for instance, without disclosing too much that's record company confidential stuff, iTunes and electronic downloads of the Synergy catalog of the last 40 years of music vastly outsell what sells on CD these days. So that transformation keeps happening, and that changes the whole nature of what is the recorded product. Is it a 45 to 50-minute collection of music and songs, or should it be shorter bursts? A lot of it sells as individual tracks.
Right.
People pick the tracks off of the first, second, fifth Synergy album, and they download.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the streaming side of it, which is even weirder because it's, at this point, really diminishing the economic base of putting enough money into artists in studio hands to be able to fund the creative product. Mm-hmm. And, that's something that the industry as a whole is going to have to look at a lot more seriously than it is right now.
Yeah.
That it may not be a problem for Taylor Swift or Kanye West, but it is going to be a problem for what were the middle-class boutique artists in the past. There was always enough enough of an economic underpinning to the industry as a whole to allow for that kind of creation that eventually would spawn off some hits at the top, but you needed that to grow, and that is in real danger now. It's not just this industry. I mean, digital displacement is happening everywhere.
Yeah.
But I know for many, many years I was part owner of a recording studio, and midline studio, we did some big hits, We recorded a lot of the Kool and the Gang hit records, but most of it was just bread and butter acts that A&R people at the major labels or even independent labels had signed, and they'd book them in there. They'd make an album. The album would come out. Nobody would really get rich. Maybe that act's fourth or fifth album would be their breakthrough. But there was an economic life cycle. And out of that cycle, people got to make records. Studios were in business. That is breaking down dramatically now. It's not anything like it was over the last 40 or so years. That's going to change the nature of how art is made.
Absolutely. Well, Larry, this has been an absolute pleasure. A fantastic interview. We'll look forward to your new Synergy stuff, and we'll keep an eye out for that. All right. Well, again, I'm just so very, very happy that we got to speak. And
no, this is great. Good interview, good questions. I really appreciate that, because sometimes it's the same old stuff again. And this was far more creative. I'm really impressed with that. Thank you.
I appreciate the compliment. All right, Larry, you have a wonderful day, and best of luck.
Hope the rain stopped. Stop here.
It did here too, yeah, which is kind of nice.
Good. Great. Okay.
All
Talk
right.
to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, man. Bye.